Ruth Ellis's story is something our first guest today knows all too well.
Yeah, as Ruth's granddaughter, Laura Enston, grew up in a family that was haunted for generations by murder and, of course, execution. But Laura joins us now to tell us why she finally feels proud to call Ruth her grandmother. Thank you for coming in this morning.
Thank you.
Both Kat and I have been gripped to the drama, Laura. It's an extraordinary experience because, of course, we had a vague knowledge of who your grandmother was. We know her name, we know what she represents. But to actually see her story and get to know who she was has been really, really enlightening. And actually, that's something that you battled with for many years because the Ruth Ellis that we've seen in this drama wasn't the Ruth Ellis that you grew up with, is it?
100%. It's night and day. So I grew up thinking that Ruth was the caricature that was portrayed in the press. This sort of social climbing, jealous, cold-blooded killer. And she was just such a different character. So obviously the press had portrayed her in a certain way. That was reinforced in the film in 1985, The Dance with a Stranger. So ultimately, I grew up thinking Ruth was this person. And ultimately, I spent probably 40 years distancing myself from it. You know, I think I took on the shame and the embarrassment of what had happened and just didn't want a part of it. So I turned it into a secret, which I now realise how debilitating it is, you know, walking around with a massive secret. And I was petrified about people finding out. And it's just been the most wonderful experience, understanding the real Ruth. And we've, you know, the book that Carol Ann Lee, which obviously the drama is based on, A Fine Day for a Hanging, just incredible. And I only read that a couple of years ago.
Really?
And it was during lockdown. I was living in Canada at the time, started reading this book, and I was just blown away by what I'd read, and I felt completely re-educated.
And this was only a few years ago.
Correct, yeah.
So why had you, as a member of her family, not had the actual story and had been sort of deceived by what the press had written about her for decades? Because
ultimately, there was so much evidence at the time that was sort of concealed. So Carol Ann Lee's book that was published a few years ago, you know, the research that she went into just uncovered so many facts and exposed so many flaws in her defence and how she was treated, and just really gave some context to the type of woman that Ruth was, you know, in post-war Britain, when, you know, women, you know, weren't being encouraged to work. They were very much being ushered back into the home to be good little housewives. Ruth was the antithesis of that. And ultimately, you know, we, as a family, you know, didn't have this information.
Yeah, because you mentioned your family there. So your mum was Georgina.
Correct, yes.
And Georgina was Ruth's daughter who was sent away.
She was sent away. Ultimately, George Ellis, so Ruth's husband, did a deal with Ruth and said, I'll give you a divorce, but you have to give up custody of Georgina. That's what happened. So Georgina went up to Manchester.
And that was your mum?
Correct, yes.
And so what was your mum like? And did your mum tell you anything about your grandmother?
She did, but she only told me the story that she knew. And ultimately, she really leaned in on the sort of the sordid side of Ruth's life, and she almost used it to sort of justify her behaviour. My mum was, you know, incredibly beautiful. She had very high-profile relationships with
like
George
your
Best.
grandmother as well, by the way.
100%.
I mean,
wow, look, there's pictures. Look,
so George Best, Richard Harris. You know, my mum knew everybody. You know, she would walk into a room, the room would turn. You know, she was so charismatic. She had so much going for her.
And she enjoyed that notoriety?
100%. She really leaned in on it. And for me, I was sort of leaned the complete opposite direction. I didn't want to be a part of it, but it was quite difficult as a child growing up because Mum was so prolific. She knew everyone knew her. So as a child growing up, it was quite difficult to distance myself from it. As I got older, and obviously we had a different surname and stuff, it became easier. So when I went into the workplace, you know, people and sort of started making new friends, people didn't know. So I've been having to go around friends that I've known 25 years and to say, hey, surprise, I've got something to tell you.
So you're trying to distance yourself from what your mum's going through, which is enjoying the notoriety and being on the front pages of the newspapers and dating the likes of George Best in his heyday. But also you were saying at school you got bullied over what happened.
100%.
Talk us through what would happen at school.
It started from, as long as I can remember, you know, people would shout in the playground, or your mum, you know, your grandma's a murderer, a prostitute, you know, and as I got older, you know, there was a group of girls at school who would, you know, sort of send me little notes in class, you know, draw the little handman game, just sort of push them under my desk. And I sort of grew up...
Did you have anyone you could share that with, or anyone you could
Not really, no. And I think, ultimately, in my quest not to be defined by it, I turned it into a secret and didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I realised how damaging that is. I think it's taken up so much of me as a person.
Yeah. And it was only during lockdown when you were listening to Elizabeth Day's podcast.
We had
Well,
it.
yeah,
It's such a brilliant podcast.
She's absolutely brilliant.
incredible.
And How to Fail.
How to Fail.
And you
I started to think, what have I failed at in life? And at the time, I was listening to some other podcasts talking about trying to get a better understanding of childhood trauma.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, this is what's happened to me. You know, at the age of 7 years old, when I find out who my grandmother is, the armour goes up.
Yeah.
And it never actually came down again.
No.
And, you know, so I was having a better understanding about, you know, what I'd failed at in life. Ultimately, you know, in my quest not to be defined by the legacy, I had been defined by it because I'd kept it a secret. And I think it has certainly affected me professionally and personally, there's no doubt about it. And I was listening to, you know, childhood trauma, understanding that piece, thinking, actually, what I've been through is a childhood trauma. And I now realise that, you know, and I was always quite dismissive of it as a kid. You think, oh, other people have been through worse, who cares? But now I realise that all childhood trauma is valid and worthy of conversation and therapy if needed.
It's been an amazing shift. It's lovely to hear the enthusiasm and passion you're talking about your grandmother now and her legacy, which is yours, of course, and the pride that you have to be her granddaughter. So much so that you're launching a petition to try and sort of get some sort of retrospective pardon or something?
Correct, yes. So this has all happened in the last 24 hours.
Okay.
So we have instructed Mishcon Durea.
Oh, yes, who's in the drama series. He plays the lawyer.
Yeah, so Victor Mishcon, his firm, approached us, and ultimately they are really passionate about continuing and fixing this. And seeking a pardon for Ruth. And ultimately, you know, we're looking for public support. So we've set up a crowdfunding page. If you Google Crowd Justice Ruth Ellis, that page will come up. But yeah, we feel like there's with all this new evidence, there's certainly something to explore here.
It's an extraordinary thing watching in the drama, watching what a proud, strong-willed, ambitious and driven woman she was, and she was absolutely didn't want anybody's sympathy at any point. It's fascinating to see, even though constantly people are saying, look, if you change the way you're going about your defence, we wouldn't necessarily have to face the death penalty, but she refused to do it. She was so principled. She's an extraordinary woman.
Incredible. She was, you know, a modern-day woman, if you think about what she'd achieved. In the face of adversity, she'd been abused, you know, by every significant man in her life. And despite that, you know, in 1955, she was a single mother. She was running a thriving business. She had an apartment above the club, you know, looking after her 2 kids. She had loads of money. She had loads of savings, and everything sort of started to unravel when David Blakely, you know, walked into her life.
Well, look, good luck with the petition.
Thank you so
we'll
much.
put the details out there so our viewers can have a look and see what it is.
Thank you.
But thank you for coming in. You can see the pride in you now as well, Laura. It's really lovely to see. You can stream that dramatisation if you haven't seen it yet, a Ruth Ellis story.
Absolutely brilliant.
It is really gripping on ITVX. And if you'd like to learn more about the documentary, The Real Ruth Ellis Story, that's also on ITVX.
Thank you for visiting our This Morning YouTube channel. We upload new content every day, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out. And we'll see you in the morning.